behind me, the warm aroma of roasted beans fading into the crisp air. I barely had time to pull my coat tighter when it happened. A sudden jolt, shoulder against shoulder. My breath hitched as I stumbled slightly, the sharp clang of metal hitting concrete snapping me back to the moment. "Whoa, sorry," a deep voice said. I looked down. A set of keys lay between our feet. His hand reached for them at the same time as mine, and for a brief moment our fingers brushed. It wasn't just a touch, it was electric. A current, like static but deeper, ran through me, settling somewhere unexpected. I met his gaze just as he looked up, and something about his expression made my stomach tighten. He wasn't just looking, he was assessing, as if trying to place me. "Didn't mean to run you over," he said, straightening up. His smile was easy, practiced, but his eyes lingered too long. I took a step back, regaining my balance. No harm done. He picked up his keys, slipping them into his pocket. "Guess I was distracted." He chuckled, shaking his head. "Hate when that happens." I gave him a polite nod, already stepping past him. But as I walked away I felt it, the weight of his gaze still on me. I shouldn't have turned around. But I did. And there he was. Watching. He caught my eye and smiled again, almost as if he had expected me to look back. Then, without another word, he turned and walked away. I exhaled sharply, shaking my head. Probably some guy who flirts with every woman he bumps into. Nothing to think about. Except minutes later, when I reached my car and pulled out my keys, a voice interrupted me. "You again." I froze. He stood by the parking meter, hands in his jacket pockets, that same easy smile on his face. "Small world," he added. I blinked, feeling an odd mix of suspicion and intrigue. This wasn't just coincidence. "Or small town," I replied. He shrugged. "I like to think fate just has a sense of humor." Before I could respond, another voice cut in. "Auntie." I turned to see my nephew approaching, his usual boyish grin in place. He was in his mid-20s now, my younger brother's only son. A good kid. The moment he reached me, he clapped the stranger on the shoulder. "You guys know each other?" he asked. "Wait, what?" The stranger smirked. "Not yet." My nephew turned to me. "This is my buddy, we go way back. He's helping me with a project this week." I glanced at him again, my pulse still slightly erratic from our earlier encounter. The fact that he was connected to my family, it unsettled me. "Huh," I said, forcing a smile. Small world indeed. They chatted for a moment and I used the opportunity to slip away, sliding into my car. My hands were still gripping the steering wheel too tightly when I finally exhaled. This was nothing. Just a weird run-in. By the time I got home, the memory of the encounter had already started to fade. I kicked off my shoes, let out a sigh and flicked on the lights. And then I saw it. A large cardboard box sitting neatly outside my door. I frowned. I hadn't ordered anything. Leaning down, I checked the label. No name. Just a note taped to the top. "You'll need this. See you soon." My stomach flipped. I glanced up, scanning the street through my window. It was quiet. Too quiet. The next morning, I met my friend for coffee, and it didn't take her long to notice something was different. She studied me over the rim of her cup, her eyes sharp, as if she were peeling back layers of me that I hadn't even realized were shifting. I tried to act normal, keeping the conversation light, but she wasn't buying it. "Something's up," she said, setting her cup down. "You're distracted." I waved her off, laughing, insisting nothing was different, but I could feel the heat creeping up my neck. How could I explain the box? The note? The way my stomach had twisted when I read those few words? It was nothing, I told myself, just a coincidence, and yet the unease sat heavy in my chest, unwilling to leave. That evening, just as I was deciding whether to open the box or leave it sitting in my hallway like an unanswered question, the doorbell rang. My breath caught. Through the peephole I saw him. Standing there. Casual, confident, hands in his pockets. "Hey," he said as soon as I opened the door, flashing that easy smile. "Your nephew told me you needed help setting this up." My heart thumped once hard. I wasn't expecting anyone." "Surprise," he said, stepping inside before I could think twice. He moved like he belonged there, like this wasn't the first time he'd walked through my door. Before I knew it, he was cutting through packing tape, unfolding the contents of the box with ease. "Good choice," he murmured, glancing at me with an unreadable expression. "Quality stuff." I stood there, unsure of what to do with my hands, unsure of what to do with the way my pulse was suddenly in my throat. As he worked, he moved too close, leaned in just enough that I could catch the scent of his cologne, subtle but intoxicating. Every time our arms brushed, I felt it, like a static charge dancing over my skin. And he knew. I could tell by the slight smirk, by the way he took his time adjusting things, drawing the moment out. Then, as if testing something, he turned to me suddenly, his face inches from mine. "You good?" The question was simple, but his tone was deliberate. My breath hitched. I could feel the shift, the unspoken tension, the quiet awareness settling between us. I swallowed hard, nodding. "Yeah. Fine." I was lying. He stretched his arms above his head, exhaling as if he had just finished a hard day's work, though all he had done was set up the system with an ease that made me wonder how often he did things like this. "Not bad," he murmured, testing the sound, adjusting the screen. I stood awkwardly, arms crossed, forcing myself to focus on the fact that I was in my own home, that this was nothing more than a favor. But he wasn't leaving and I wasn't asking him to. "You drink coffee this late?" he asked casually, glancing at me as he ran his fingers along the edge of the console. "Depends," I said too quickly, regretting how my voice wavered. His smirk was barely there, but it was enough. "I could use a cup," he admitted, rolling his shoulders like he was settling in. My throat went dry. I should have told him no, should have thanked him for his help and sent him on his way, but instead I heard myself say, yeah, okay." I busied myself in the kitchen, heart hammering, fingers shaking as I scooped coffee into the filter. He was watching me. I could feel it, the way his gaze trailed my movements, the way he leaned against the doorway like he had nothing but time. "You live alone?" His voice was calm, but there was something underneath, something weightier than the question itself. I cleared my throat. "I have for a while now." "By choice?" he asked, tilting his head slightly, his eyes sharp, reading between the lines. I swallowed. "Not exactly." His expression didn't change, but his silence did something to me, made the air between us feel heavier, like he was pulling me into something I wasn't sure I could handle. I turned back to the coffee, trying to regain control, but then he was closer, not touching me, but near enough that my body reacted before my mind could stop it. "You're different than I expected," he said, voice low. "And how's that?" I asked, gripping the edge of the counter. He didn't answer right away, just studied me, his gaze moving slowly, deliberately, and then before I could prepare myself he reached up, gently tucking a strand of hair behind my ear. My skin burned where his fingers brushed. My breath caught. I should have moved away. I should have laughed it off. But I didn't. And then his lips were on mine, soft but sure, like he knew exactly what he was doing, like he had planned this all along. My body responded instantly, years of restraint dissolving in seconds. Just as I started to lean in, just as my fingers curled into his shirt, he pulled back, eyes dark, unreadable. "I should go," he murmured, stepping away. And just like that he was gone, leaving me standing there, breathless, coffee forgotten, pulse unsteady, wondering what had just happened, and why I already wanted more. She stirred her coffee too slowly, the spoon clinking against the porcelain in a way that made my nerves tighten. I knew that look, the one she gave me when she was about to say something I wouldn't like, the one that meant she had been watching, thinking, connecting dots I had purposely left scattered. "I know that face," I muttered, taking a sip, trying to act casual, but the way she tilted her head made my stomach sink. "He's too good to be true," she said flatly, skipping the build-up, going straight for the kill. I let out a short laugh, shaking my head, but she wasn't smiling. "Men like that, they don't just show up out of nowhere," she continued, setting her cup down, fingers tapping against the table. "They don't just happen into your life, set up your TV, look at you like you're the only woman in the room and disappear like a ghost. That's not real." I opened my mouth to argue, but nothing came. Instead, I shrugged, feigning indifference, pretending like I hadn't spent the last 2 days replaying that kiss in my head, like I hadn't caught myself staring at my phone, waiting, hoping. "I think you're overreacting," I finally said, forcing a smirk. He was just being nice. But even I didn't believe it. Later that night, alone in my house, I caught myself doing something that sent a chill down my spine. I had poured a glass of wine, settled into my couch, and without realizing it, had picked a movie I never watched but had always meant to, something I had mentioned in passing once years ago, something no one else knew I had wanted to see. My pulse quickened. It was just a coincidence. It had to be. But then I thought about the way he spoke to me, how he always seemed one step ahead, how he never had to ask me twice what I liked, what I wanted. As if he already knew. As if he had always known. I shook off the feeling, turning up the volume, drowning out my own thoughts. The next day when my phone buzzed and his name appeared, I didn't hesitate. I didn't think about the warning, about the nagging feeling in my gut, about the way my friend's voice had echoed in my head all night. I answered. I let myself smile. And when he asked if I wanted to see him again, I said yes before he even finished the sentence. The knock at my door was firm, familiar, a sound that belonged to another life, one I thought I had left behind. My pulse spiked as I hesitated, fingers frozen on the handle, knowing before I even opened it who would be standing there. And then there he was. My ex-husband, looking older but somehow unchanged, standing on my doorstep like he hadn't shattered everything a decade ago. "We need to talk," he said, his voice lower, softer than I remembered, the edge of arrogance replaced by something dangerously close to regret. I wanted to slam the door in his face, tell him he was too late, that I had built something new without him, but I didn't. Instead I stepped back, letting him in, hating myself for the way my chest tightened as he moved past me like he still belonged here. He talked, I listened, arms crossed, body tense as he unraveled the story I had sworn I would never care to hear. "I made mistakes," he admitted, eyes locked on mine. "But losing you, that was the biggest one." His words hit harder than I expected, dredging up memories I had spent years burying, nights of laughter, mornings tangled in sheets, the way he used to look at me like I was the only thing he'd ever need. My throat tightened. "You cheated," I reminded him, forcing steel into my voice, but it didn't land the way it should have. Because the truth was, he had been my first real love, and some ghosts don't fade easily. He reached for my hand, hesitated, then pulled back like he was afraid to push too far, but I didn't move away. And then it happened. Slow, inevitable, a moment neither of us stopped. His lips brushed mine, and for a split second I let myself go, let the past pull me under, let my body remember what it was like to be wanted by but I didn't move away. And then it happened. Slow, inevitable, a moment neither of us stopped. His lips brushed mine, and for a split second I let myself go, let the past pull me under, let my body remember what it was like to be wanted by someone who once swore he'd never hurt me. But the second it ended, reality crashed down, sharp and suffocating. I pushed him away, heart pounding, guilt rising before I could name it. "This was a mistake," I whispered, but before he could answer my phone buzzed, shattering the air between us. My stomach dropped at the name on the screen. I answered, voice unsteady, and then came the words that turned my blood cold. "I don't like sharing," the young man said, his tone calm but sharp enough to cut. "And I really hope I don't have to remind you of that." My nephew's voice was hesitant, careful, the way someone speaks when they're trying not to push too hard but can't ignore the weight of what they know. "Have you noticed anything off about him?" he asked, stirring his drink, eyes flicking up to meet mine. My stomach tightened. I forced a light laugh, pretending not to understand, but he didn't drop it. "I mean, I've known him a long time, but lately, I don't know. He's different. It's like he's watching everything." My grip on my glass tightened. "You're imagining things," I said too quickly, but the truth was I had felt it too. The shift, the way his presence had started to wrap around me like a shadow, the way his words lingered long after he was gone. My nephew exhaled, shaking his head. "Just be careful, okay?" He didn't press further, but the unease had already rooted itself deep. That night my phone rang. My best friend's voice was sharp, urgent. "I need to see you," she said, no greeting, no explanation, just a command. 20 minutes later, I was sitting across from her, my pulse uneven as she slid her phone across the table. "Look at this," she said, her lips pressed into a thin line. I hesitated, but then I saw it. Texts, photos, his name staring back at me like a punch to the stomach. Another woman. Another life. He had been playing this game long before I entered it. The realization should have made me sick, should have broken the last thread holding me there, but instead all I felt was anger, a slow, burning fury curling in my chest. "End this," she urged, gripping my wrist. "Before it gets worse." I nodded, but when I got home he was already waiting, leaning against my door like he knew I would come back shaken, like he had been expecting me to run but was ready to pull me right back in. "You look upset," he murmured, stepping closer, his voice smooth, knowing. "Want to tell me why?" I swallowed hard, my hands shaking, but when I opened my mouth, the words tangled on my tongue. He smiled then, slow and deliberate, reaching out, brushing his fingers down my arm. "You don't really want to leave," he whispered, and somehow, despite everything, despite what I knew, I didn't move. I didn't speak. And when he pulled me into him, I let him. The truth didn't come in one devastating moment. It unraveled in pieces, small cracks forming until the entire illusion shattered around me. At first it was just a feeling, a gnawing unease I couldn't shake, a sense that something was slipping through my fingers even as he pulled me closer. Then it was whispers, half-spoken warnings, the way my best friend hesitated before she spoke, as if she wasn't sure I was ready to hear it. And then finally it was proof, cold, undeniable, staring back at me from a screen I wished I hadn't looked at. A reservation for two at a restaurant I'd never been to. A familiar smile captured in a photo, but the woman next to him wasn't me. My stomach twisted as my best friend watched me, waiting for the explosion, but all I felt was numb. "You knew," I said quietly, my voice eerily calm. She exhaled, setting her phone down, rubbing her temples like she was exhausted from carrying this secret. "I suspected," she admitted, "but I had to be sure before I told you." The betrayal wasn't just his. It was the silence, the knowledge that everyone else had seen what I refused to. I walked out without another word, my legs moving before my mind could catch up. The city lights blurred as I drove, my hands gripping the wheel too tight, my breath uneven. By the time I reached my nephew's place, I didn't even know what I was going to say. But he did. The moment he saw me, his face fell, guilt and regret clouding his expression. "You found out," he said, more statement than question. I stared at him, searching for answers in the face of the one person I thought had been on my side. "How long have you known?" My voice cracked, betraying me. He ran a hand through his hair, exhaling. "Longer than I should have," he admitted. I didn't know it would go this far. Something inside me snapped. "You introduced me to him," I spat, the weight of those words hitting harder than I expected. "You brought him into my life." He flinched like I had struck him. "I thought he was different," he whispered, voice thick with regret. "I thought he cared about you." A bitter laugh escaped me, sharp and broken. So did I. But the truth was, I had ignored the signs, silenced the warnings, let myself believe in something that had never been real. And now I was paying the price. The air in the room was thick, the kind of silence that wasn't empty but charged, filled with the weight of something about to break. I wasn't supposed to be here. He didn't expect me. And that's exactly why I saw what I saw. The door was slightly ajar, just enough for me to hear the low murmur of his voice, the quiet laughter that wasn't mine. My stomach clenched, a slow dread crawling up my spine as I pushed the door open just enough to see inside. And there he was. With her. His back was to me, but I didn't need to see his face to know exactly what was happening. The way his hands rested on her waist, the way she leaned into him, her fingers trailing up his arm, nails dragging lightly across his skin. And then it happened. His head dipped, her lips parted, and before I could even process the betrayal, he kissed her. It wasn't hesitation. It wasn't confusion. It was deliberate. Confident. The kind of kiss that said this wasn't the first time, that whatever was happening between them had been happening long before I walked in. My chest tightened, a sharp, crushing sensation that stole the breath from my lungs. I didn't make a sound, didn't give myself away, but something in me shattered so loudly I swore they should have heard it. My hands clenched into fists, nails biting into my palms, but I couldn't move. I just stood there, frozen, staring at the undeniable proof of what I had refused to see all along. Rewrite the story to make it something easier for me to swallow. "You're overreacting," he added, reaching for my hand, but I stepped back, and for the first time, I saw the flicker of something unfamiliar in his eyes. Uncertainty. I had never pulled away before. I exhaled, slow and steady, forcing my hands to stay at my sides, forcing myself to stand my ground. "I'm done," I said simply, watching as the realization finally set in. He opened his mouth, then closed it, like he couldn't believe I wasn't falling for it this time. "Don't do this," he tried again, voice lower now, more urgent. "You know what we have is real." But I just shook my head because I finally understood. None of it had been real. Not for him. I turned, grabbed my coat and walked past him, feeling the weight of every step, feeling the last pieces of whatever this had been crumble behind me. He called my name once, twice, but I didn't stop. Not this time. Not ever again. Days passed, then weeks, but time didn't feel the same anymore. I went back to my routine, to the quiet, to the life I had before him, but it wasn't the same because now I knew what it felt like to be fooled, to be played, to willingly walk into something I should have run from. My mornings were hollow, my nights even worse because no matter how much I told myself I had moved on, my mind still lingered on what could have been, on the version of him that never really existed. The cafe felt different. My house felt different. Even my own reflection in the mirror didn't feel like mine anymore. I had spent so much time wrapped up in something that was never real that now I didn't even know what was. My best friend sat across from me, arms crossed, watching me pick at my food with disinterest. She had been patient, but I could feel the weight of what she had been holding back since the beginning. "You want me to say it?" she finally asked, tilting her head. I didn't answer, but she did anyway. "I told you so." The words weren't cruel, they weren't smug, they were just true. I let out a breath, forcing a weak smile. "Yeah," I admitted. "You did." But the worst part was I had known. Deep down I had known. I had just chosen not to listen. That night, I sat in my dimly lit living room, staring at the phone on the table. I hadn't heard from him in days, but I knew it was coming. He was the kind of man who always had the last word. And then, as if on cue, the screen lit up. One message. One sentence. "You'll always be special." I let the words settle, let them sink in, let them dig into all the parts of me that still ached. And then, without hesitation, without second-guessing, without allowing myself another wasted moment, I pressed delete. No reply. No goodbye. No more wondering what he really meant. It was over. Really over. But as I set the phone down, staring at the blank screen, I realized something I hadn't before. I wasn't sad. I wasn't relieved. I was just empty.